What causes the moon to orbit the Earth? What causes the high and low tides, the changes of the seasons, the changing positions of the planets in the sky? What causes material bodies to fall, or gases to expand, or the blood to circulate throughout the body? These causal questions had been asked and answered by Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Boyle, Harvey, and Newton. But we ask, what causes cancer? What causes schizophrenia? What causes the wars that we have? What causes the degenerative process of physical aging, the degradation of American cities? What causes inflation or unemployment? What causes the sighting of flying saucers? These are causal questions which plague us in our time. Do you agree with Hume that all our thinking about matters of fact is causal, and that whenever we are concerned about matters of fact, we think about what causes a given effect? Hume claims that the relation of cause and effect is the crucial concept in all our thinking about factual matters. But if the causal relationship plays so dominant a role in everyday life, in science, philosophy, theology, and morals, then surely, says Hume, we must ask some questions about it to try to understand it, rather than assume we already know what it means. First of all, he asks the typically Humean question, the question that Hume always asks: from what impression does the idea of cause come? We already know what Hume is up to. He is using the devastating principle he has already established, that every idea has a corresponding impression from which it arises. An idea, you remember, is nothing but an image of the impression from which it has arisen. Your idea of your mother is nothing but the images of the direct sensory impressions of seeing her, hearing her, touching her that you have had. Without these impressions, you would have no idea of your mother. Where there is no impression, there is no idea. Where there is no impression, anyone who claims to have an idea is talking nonsense. His idea is meaningless. For Hume, a word is meaningful only if it refers to an impression or to an idea which copies that impression. Hume's principle: no impression, no idea. No impression, the idea is meaningless, is nonsense, is a fraud. Now, this principle is, as we have seen, his most powerful empiricist wrecking ball. And so Hume asks the seemingly harmless question: from what impression, if any, does the idea of cause arise? It must be the case that the idea of causation arises in the mind from the way in which objects are related to each other rather than from individual objects. And so Hume asks, from what impressions of relations between objects does the idea of cause arise? What are these relations? Now, the popular everyday idea of causality, says Hume, arises from our impressions of two kinds of relations between objects. First is the relation of contiguity or contact. We ordinarily consider that for something to be the cause of something else, it must touch it, be spatially connected to it, as when we see one billiard ball make contact with another. When we see the second billiard ball move, we are likely to say that the first billiard ball caused it to move. Another relation between objects, which is essential to our everyday idea of causality, is that the effect, namely the movement of the second billiard ball, should immediately follow the cause. In other words, that the cause should be prior in time to the effect. We consider billiard ball 1 the cause of the motion of billiard ball 2 when we have two impressions of the relations between them, that billiard ball 1 is spatially contiguous with, in spatial contact with billiard ball 2, and that it is also temporally prior to it. These two relations taken together, the cause being spatially contiguous with the effect and temporally prior to it, Hume calls their conjunction. But a third kind of relationship must also take place in our everyday idea of cause and effect. The third relationship, Hume says, is that of necessary connection. And he adds That relation, necessary connection, is of much greater importance than any of the other two. By necessary connection is meant the relation between cause and effect in which the cause necessarily produces the effect. For example, the impact of billiard ball 1 on billiard ball 2 is the cause, which necessarily produces the effect of the motion of billiard ball 2. But from what impression, Hume persists, do we derive the idea of necessary connection between cause and effect? This is no easy matter, says Hume. We must beat about in neighboring fields to see if we can flush out the answer. First, he asks, why do we believe in the causal principle at all? Why do we believe that everything that occurs has some cause that necessarily produces it? This principle, that everything must have a cause, that nothing is uncaused, that something cannot come from nothing, was regarded by Descartes and by the scholastic philosophers before him and by the rationalistic philosophers after him as a self-evident truth that proves itself directly to reason. But Hume wastes no time in destroying the rationalist defense of the causal principle that everything has some cause that necessarily produced it. The rationalists have not shown, he says, that the causal principle is absolutely certain, self-evident to reason, and needs no more proof than does 2 plus 2 equals 4. Hume concludes that there is no rational proof whatsoever of the causal principle. If we believe in the causal principle, he says, it is only through habit or custom that we do so. There is no rational basis for it. But now Hume moves on to a second question on which he is going to concentrate his greatest energies. Why do we think that a particular cause must necessarily have a particular effect? We cannot know this by reason. We cannot make a rational analysis of the essence of fire to show that fire produces the necessary effect of burning the human skin. As we will see, he argues that reason can tell us nothing about factual matters like fire. Reason he restricts to the areas of mathematics and logic. In this way, he makes nonsense of all of the efforts of Plato to offer a rational analysis of the pure forms, or of Descartes to offer clear and distinct rational ideas of substances. But suppose we look for the necessary impression of necessary connection between a particular cause and effect. For example, between a burning match in my hand and the sensation of heat which it produces on my fingers. But I can find no impression here of necessary connection. I see a flame and I feel a burning sensation. The flame is spatially contiguous to and temporally prior to the sensation of heat in my fingers. These are the first two relations that are required for the everyday idea of causality. But the third, the impression of necessary connection, I do not have, nor can I have it, since it is already clear that all that I can have impressions of are separate sensations. But if neither reason nor sensory impressions give us the right to say so, why do we say that a particular cause necessarily has a particular effect? He finally comes up with the answer. He thinks, we have the idea of a necessary connection between a particular cause and effect after we experience their conjunction repeatedly. He calls this constant conjunction. If we experience repeatedly fire as spatially contiguous to and temporally prior to my fingers having a sensation of heat, then, without any further ceremony, says Hume, we call the one cause and the other effect. But the repetition of impressions of constant conjunction, spatially and temporally, of the flaming match and the burning sensation in the fingers still does not provide an impression of necessary connection. Repeated instances of fire burning do not give us an impression of necessary connection between the flame and the burning sensation. The necessary connection between the two is not something that can be observed. One can see the flame. Another impression, spatially adjoining it, is the impression of a burning sensation. But where can one observe necessary connection? Where can one have an impression of necessary connection between the two, such that the effect must occur, that it is the necessary result of the cause? But if the idea of necessary connection has no corresponding impression, if we cannot derive the idea from observation of repeated and constant conjunction, then on Hume's own principle, no impression, no idea, the idea of necessary connection between causes and effects becomes meaningless, a fraud, and nonsense. But Hume hangs on because the causal relation is so important to analyze. He asks, where then does the idea come from? This crucial and powerful idea, since it does not come from reason and it does not come from a sensory impression. What then is its source? It must then be subjective. It must come from the mind. And specifically, it must come from the psychological laws of association of ideas. The idea of necessary connection between causes and effects is not in the objects we observe, but only in the mind, he concludes. For after we have observed the constant conjunction of fire and the sensation of burning in our fingers, we feel a necessity of the mind to associate fire with burning. After we have experienced A followed by B repeatedly, by the association of ideas, we come to expect B to occur after A occurs. We have formed a habit of anticipating that B will occur after A. But even more, we feel compelled. We have a feeling of compulsion or propulsion. We have a gentle force of propelling us to expect B. It is this compulsion or necessity of the mind by the law of association of ideas to associate A with B, the flame with the burning sensation. It is this that is the internal and purely psychological source of our idea of necessary causal connection. Thus, the idea of necessary connection between particular causes and effects is derived not from rational self-evidence and not from any empirical sense impression, but only from the psychological association of our ideas. Hume's point is that we cannot perceive any cause producing necessarily any effect. The idea of necessary causality is therefore, on his own principle, worthless, false, and a fraud. When any A and B, the flame and the burning sensation, are in constant conjunction, then when A occurs, we expect B to occur. We have the habit of anticipating B. We feel a necessity, a compulsion to expect B. We have now followed the main lines of Hume's very lengthy analysis of causality. As an extreme radical empiricist, he has demolished the claims of science to have discovered necessary causal laws of nature, such as the laws of mechanics, the law of gravity, the law of the circulation of the blood. Hume has shown that causal necessity is not an objective relationship between objects which scientists can observe, but is only a subjective compulsion to relate objects by the psychological laws of association. Causal necessity has no source in sense impressions, but its source is only in the laws of our own psychology. There are no necessary connections between objects, no necessary connection between the moon and the rise and fall of the tides. There is only the psychological necessity of our associating ideas with one another. As Hume himself says, objects have no discoverable connection together, nor is it from any other principle but custom that we draw any inference from one to the other. Do you think that scientific laws establish necessary causal connections? Do you think that every time an electric spark passes through a mixture of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, that the necessary result will be that the gases will disappear and that water will begin to form? But Hume says all you can know is what you have observed. How do you know that the next time you pass the electric spark through the mixture of gases that water will form? Aren't you assuming that the electric spark in the mixture of gases is the necessary cause of the formation of water as its necessary effect? But Hume has tried to show you that you have no right to talk of necessary connections. Hume's point is that the idea of necessary connection between cause and effect is something that experience can never give us. Each impression that we have in experience is a separate experience. What impression will follow another? What will happen when the spark touches the mixture of gases? This we can only learn by experience. But experience cannot guarantee that this effect is necessary. Experience cannot even guarantee that it will ever happen again, even though it has happened repeatedly in the past. But when we have impressions of the constant conjunction of the mixture of gases ignited by the spark, and we see the water forming, we come to feel compelled to expect that this will happen in the future, and we mistakenly think that there is a necessary causal connection between the two. And so, Hume now redefines the idea of the cause-effect relation. A cause is an object in constant spatial and temporal conjunction with another, so that the experience of the one compels the mind to expect the other. This is all that we can mean by the cause-effect relationship. What impact does Hume's empiricist demolition of necessary causal laws have upon the sciences? For no scientific law is it possible, according to Hume, to claim that it establishes a necessary connection between X and Y, between the gravitational pull of the moon and the rise and fall of the tides. There is no necessary connection between the injection of penicillin and the killing of organisms that have invaded the body. These are only observed constant conjunctions, together with our own psychological compulsion to relate the one with the other. But could we not try to save the idea of necessary connection in scientific laws by relying on the uniformity of nature? Can't we know that causal relations in constant conjunction in the past will continue to hold in the future because nature is, after all, uniform? If nature is uniform and the same regularities are constantly uniformly repeated, then can we not know that the future will be like the past, that the same constant conjunctions will always be observable? But Hume will not let you save the idea of necessary connection by calling upon the principle of the uniformity of nature. Immediately he asks, how do you know that nature is uniform? This you cannot prove by reason, this you cannot prove by experience. And thus the outcome of Hume's driving, consistent empiricism, which requires that the only basis for our knowledge be in sensory impressions, the outcome leads to the conclusion that we have no knowledge. We cannot know that any scientific law will be true in the future, no matter how often it has been confirmed in the past. The whole edifice of scientific laws collapses under the wrecking ball of Hume's empiricism. Perhaps at this point you will try to think of some way out of Hume's attack upon the validity of scientific causal knowledge. You may remember from Descartes the importance of mathematics as the very model of absolute self-evident truth. Has Hume forgotten mathematics as a source for truth? Not at all. One of his greatest influences on 20th century thought is his view of mathematics and logic, the two types of reasoning which for Descartes were the only source of certainty in our knowledge and were the model for the new sciences. Says Hume, we have been talking about one kind of knowledge, namely knowledge of matters of fact. This, as we have seen, according to Hume, consists only in our impressions and ideas. There is no necessity that any particular impression will follow any other impression. The contrary of what usually occurs in the observed constant conjunction of things is possible. How do you know, Hume asks, that the sun will rise tomorrow? No necessary causal law guarantees it. It is just as intelligible and without any logical contradiction to say the sun will not rise tomorrow. There is no more logical necessity for the one than for the other. We can never know that a fact must be so. But there is another kind of knowledge which Hume sets up in opposition to knowledge of matters of fact. This other kind of knowledge he calls knowledge of the relations of ideas. Mathematics, specifically geometry, algebra, and arithmetic, give us knowledge of the relations of ideas. This is the domain of certainty. The propositions of mathematics are either self-evidently certain or they can be demonstrated by deductive reasoning to have complete certainty. The truths of mathematics assert relationships between ideas, between abstract symbols. They are formal, abstract truths. They tell us, these truths of mathematics, nothing about matters of fact, and matters of fact cannot refute them. The truth 2 plus 2 is 4 is a formal truth. It is true independent of any experience that we might have. Furthermore, you can't deny a proposition which states a relation between ideas. Can you deny, without being illogical, that 2 plus 2 are 4? But Hume says you can deny that the sun will rise tomorrow without being illogical. And so you say, aha, Hume does admit that we have some knowledge, namely mathematics, which can give us absolute certainty. But there is a catch. Mathematical propositions must pay a price for yielding absolute certainty. It is that mathematics is not truth about anything which exists. It is not truth about any matters of fact. Mathematics is only empty, abstract, formal truth which tells you nothing about existence. No proposition which states a relation between ideas can establish any truth about existence. Thus, there is a trade-off. Statements about formal relations of ideas, like 2 plus 2 are 4, give us knowledge which has certainty. But on the other hand, it is merely formal truth, empty and abstract. It gives no information about existence. Statements about matters of fact, on the other hand, give us information about facts, about existence, but they provide no certainty, not even probability. And now we have seen that Hume, in conceding that mathematics gives us absolutely certain knowledge, is by no means agreeing with the rationalists like Descartes. Descartes tried to show that the coquetot was a self-evident truth, and at the same time it was a statement about a matter of fact, namely my own existence. From Hume's point of view, Descartes was either totally confused or a total fraud. Hume's distinction between two kinds of statements or propositions has been maintained by most 20th century empiricists. His propositions stating relations of ideas are now in the 20th century called analytic propositions. Hume's propositions stating matters of fact are now in the 20th century called synthetic propositions. Like Hume, present empiricists maintain that no synthetic proposition, what Hume called matters of fact, can have certainty. Certainty is the exclusive property of analytic propositions, what Hume called relations of ideas. One of the goals which Hume set out to achieve was to discover the limits of human knowledge. As far as our knowledge of the world of facts is concerned, we are limited, says Hume, to our impressions and their corresponding ideas. and we have no notion as to what causes them. And so metaphysics, which is concerned with the ultimate nature of reality, is impossible. It attempts to transcend the limits of our understanding, to know what we cannot know, what we have no possible impressions of. The idea of physical substance is meaningless. The idea of mental substance is also meaningless. Descartes' claim that I am a thinking substance is meaningless. There is no impression to which the idea of thinking substance corresponds. Moreover, says Hume, the idea of my having personal identity is meaningless. There is no impression from which is derived an identical single self. When, says Hume, I enter intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular impression or perception of heat or cold, light or shade, an impression of love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never catch myself. And so Hume offers his famous definition of mind. The mind, he says, is a bundle or collection of different perceptions or impressions which succeed one another with an inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement. But there is no identity in these fleeting impressions. Mind is nothing but a heap of moving, changing impressions. The idea that we have personal identity or that we have a soul is false and meaningless. We have no impression of personal identity, no impression of a soul. Is it any wonder that at the end of Book 1 of the treatise, when Hume looks at what his wrecking ball has demolished, he is badly shaken? He writes in this book, "The intense view of these manifold contradictions and imperfections in human reason has so wrought upon me and heated my brain that I am ready to reject all belief and reasoning and can look upon no opinion as more probable than another. Where am I, or what am I? From what causes do I derive my existence, and to what condition shall I return? I am confounded with all these questions and begin to fancy myself in the most deplorable condition imaginable, environed in the deepest darkness and utterly deprived of the use of every member and faculty." This outpouring of anguish is rare among philosophers. Next time, we shall see how Hume quiets his nerves after his work of destruction.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.